the only species that's ever worked out how to blow up everything and kill everyone. Most of these processes in the past have happened over long periods of time. I think our capacity as the apex species on Earth, because of the technologies we've developed, and that's very clear with the development of atomic and weapons of mass destruction, our ability to introduce elements that can destroy us all, including tweaking chemical, biological, etc., as well as the radiological. So our ability to destroy each other on an epic scale is something that no other species has had before.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week has written a history that begins at the start of time, really. Peter Frankopan is known for writing books that change the way we think about history and the world. He's famous for the Silk Roads, which he wrote some years ago, and now he's written a book called The Earth Transformed, An Untold History. And for a book that starts 4.5 billion years ago, it's not bad. I mean, it's chunky, but it's less than 700 pages. So Peter, welcome. So tell me, what is The Earth Transformed, An Untold History about?
It's a big, broad history about all the different corners of this amazing planet that we live on, drifting through space since the beginning of time, trying to see how the natural world has formed around us, the things we don't often pay attention to, the oceans, the continents, the distribution of rivers, and how that's shaped our human history, and in the same time, how we humans have adapted the environments and the natural ecologies around us, both for good and for ill. So trying to recenter how we think about nature and the natural world as part of the way in which our lives all play out.
Your first chapter begins at the beginning of time. And I wonder why, and how reliable any of that's. What's your source material for 4.5 billion years ago?
I think why I start at the beginning of time is because when we think about our own species, it's easy to think that we've been here from the beginning. That's the human experience is, the way we think about history, and all the rest of it, like you might say, well, it's unprovable and it's all very distant and we don't really have any granular detail. But at the same time, we are the products of massive climatic changes in the past. So humans have been on this planet for about 0.00001% of its existence. And that means that the way in which our ancestors 5, 10, 15, 20,000 years ago, particularly when they start to write things down and we know what they think rather than what they're doing, means that the periods before then, we maybe think about slightly differently. So we've had 5 big mass extinction events, one through oxidation, one through volcanic eruptions, tectonic plates and so on, these enormous things that last, in some cases, millions of years. And that produced a Goldilocks zone that suits our species ideally. And if you take a slightly different view of the natural world, those previous cycles of the world's history, for almost 99.99% of its existence, have suited other species, just not ours. We wouldn't have been able to function. And the reason to talk that through is to say, well, we're the products of all these great extinctions in the past. All life on Earth descends from them. But I suppose one could push it even further, which is that in some of the things that you cover on other days of the week, like geopolitics, like oil, like fossil fuels, all trace back to these events too. So the distribution of the world's hydrocarbon basins, the big fields that carry 500 million barrels of oil or more, mean that places like the Middle East, which were not geographically that important 150 years ago, have been the central part of the world, I guess, for the last 100 years, as the fight for oil and gas have driven our transitions to where we might be going with clean energy. And then what happens when those resources either run out or we do turn clean? Then those carbon resources that formed by haphazard events millions and tens of millions of years ago changes these dynamics. And Helen Thompson, a colleague of mine at Cambridge, has written very powerfully around that. Here we are in Europe in 2023, energy is short, very exposed to the crisis in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. But one of our challenges is we don't have enough energy to be able to keep ourselves moving. We need to import. And so if we put the human experience into this much bigger picture about how things have dealt the ecological lottery in the past in a different way, then things open up to look at things in different ways. And, that's true even when it comes to coerced labor and the transatlantic slave trade. We can see the similar kind of rhythms of where land has been most fertile in driving some of these really big events and moments in history too.
Because you talk about at the beginning of the book about how you're trying to achieve at least two things. One is to look at the impact of climate on our history and culture. The other is how humans have impacted the world over those periods of time as well. But this comes almost from a sort of a sense of fear about the world from when you were growing up. And you reference, I'm delighted to say, my old programme Newsround that you watched as a kid.
Well, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and the things that we used to watch every day at 5:05 was instability in the Middle East, Russia, the Soviet Union parking SS-20 missiles into Eastern Europe, the Khmer Rouge and genocide in Cambodia, what were called the boat people from Southeast Asia trying to escape. And as we grew up in the 80s, we were very aware that there was political tension and potentially existential threats to humanity and our existence, but also to the ecological crises too. And so things like 5 Mile Island nuclear accident, above all, the Union Carbide a breakdown in Bhopal that ended up killing tens of thousands of people, and then the Chernobyl accident in the mid-80s that led to catastrophic suffering, not just of those who were in the blast zone of Chernobyl and the poor people who died immediately, but in terms of the fact that when something bad happens, we're all potentially exposed to radiation poisoning. And I think that fear of ecological crisis was something that was very burnt into our generation in terms of what might go wrong and when it was likely to go wrong. The ozone layer was another real thing that was covered very, very regularly on Newsround, in fact, in the middle and the late 80s. And the real breakthrough of finding an ozone agreement between the US and the Soviet Union and the other countries on Earth to try to stop using CFCs. And I think that paved a way towards the start of the 90s of thinking the world was going to be a happy place. The Soviet Union had collapsed. We all thought that freedom were here to last. There were a few hotspots, obviously, but that way in which we would connect would all be great for us globally. And I suppose looking back at these last 30 years, there are lots of ways in which it has been. These last 3 decades have been, by and large, quite good for the global south, as they're called. For poverty alleviation has been pretty good. It will be imperfect. Maternal health care has improved. Lots of things we can show off about the last 30 years. But the downside of that is over these last 3 decades, we've burnt half of the world's fossil fuels and since humanity has been in existence. So our levels of carbon dioxide particles in the atmosphere are far greater than they were before the Industrial Revolution, almost double the scale now. And that comes towards accelerating a warming process that was first identified not on Newsround or by the scientists at the time, but by scientists working in the 1800s. The idea that if we burnt fossil fuels, the world was going to warm up and there would be consequences, and you'd have losers, but also winners. So
how did they identify that back then?
Well, there was concern that we were changing the environment through ignition of coal in particular, and people could see that you would put soot into the atmosphere, and that was never going to be a great outcome in terms of people's respiratory health, but also what other impacts there were. And humans have always been very interested in what our footprint does to the world. So there's lots of discussion in the Americas before then even that cutting down of forests to make way for fields changed rainfall patterns, and deforestation, as we now know, is very closely linked to changes in rainfall. By the middle of the 19th century, scientists like Eunice Foote were doing controlled experiments using test tubes to see what happened if you burnt fossil fuels and put carbon into the air, and could see that there was a clear effect on temperature changes. And by the start of the 1900s, it was absolutely clear that there was an anthropogenic impact by the way in which we chose to live. And anthropogenic impacts have always happened. If you chop down all the trees in Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, as happened very quickly after the first cities there started to be built, you have to bring in sources of wood from elsewhere. You need to find metals from elsewhere, and you need to build trade networks that allow you to globalize. And again, as we've learned in the last few years and decades, globalization has lots of positive outcomes, but it has lots of very negative ones, and it parks problems often in other people's parts of the world out of sight and out of mind. And that, I think, is one of the challenges we have in the worlds that I have worked on in the past. In Asia, where today 496 of the world's 500 most polluted cities are in Asia. And that's not just because we in the West consume and live in the way which we do, but a large part of that is because industrial production has been moved from places with high environmental standards and expensive labour forces to parts of the world where there's a benefit in being able to do production there. So these kinds of ways in which we connect to each other and connect different regions together are really interesting, I think, but also quite important to see how we defer paying the ecological price by pushing things out of our eye line. And that means we are here in the early 21st century almost caught by surprise that suddenly we're facing a system breakdown of ecologies and biodiversities that some of my colleagues are talking about, not a mass extinction that might happen, but one that's already underway.
Well, let's talk about the slave trade, because you do a big section on that, and it's tempting to think, well, this is sort of a bit of a dogleg into something that he's obviously interested in. But explain why the climate is so key to that.
If you're talking about the transformation of the Earth, then probably we should think quite seriously about the transformation of human lives in our story. And the transatlantic slave trade is probably the single most important event, both in terms of its scale, brutality, legacies, etc. It doesn't need me to go into any of that. It's so self-evident. But I think when I was when I thought about the transatlantic slave trade in the past, I'd always wondered why was it that Europeans, who are the great beneficiaries ecologically and economically, didn't build their slave plantation or their plantation complexes in West Africa. Right? It's much closer, cheaper, etc. Why humans were shipped across the Atlantic in such large numbers? And it was partly to do with the resilience of states in West Africa to keep the Europeans away. So, as one colleague of mine put it, for hundreds of years the Europeans couldn't get within a cannon shot of the coast, or get beyond a cannon shot of the coast. As it so happened, when Columbus and his followers crossed the Atlantic and opened up new places to grow things like sugar and tobacco and cotton, some of the most wealthy parts of the world, ecologically with the soils to do that, were in West Africa, but others were in the southern part of the United States, which lent itself very well to cash crops, which are very labor intensive. And to be able to take people from one side of the world to make them work for free and in horrible conditions for the benefit of mercantile capital, I can't really add anything to the story that's told by many of my colleagues so powerfully. But what I think is interesting is around the fact that it wasn't just that people could be bought and shipped. It was that there was an immunological advantage to peoples in West Africa, many of whom carry a genetic mutation that make them resistant to falciparum malaria, because malaria was endemic in West Africa for thousands and thousands of years. And that resistance meant that people who came from disease-infected and disease-compromised parts of West Africa had much longer life expectancies than other people from Africa, or certainly from Europe.
And did they know that at the time? I mean, were slaves from West Africa sold as hardier, stronger, longer living?
Well, I don't think the relationship and link was made between scientifically, but where you can tell that there must have been part of it is that slaves from some parts of West Africa were much more valuable and considered much more valuable, which is is correlated to genetic mutation patterns. So peoples who came from parts of Niger and Burkina Faso, from Angola, had a different price to ones from elsewhere. And so that maps very closely onto disease resistance. And as malaria establishes itself in the United States, particularly in the 1680s and 1690s onwards, suddenly the value of human life starts to change because the requirements become greater. People start to realize that for some reason resistance is higher. And so you invest your money in a different way. And I think it's horrific to see that these lands are, on the one hand, the product of past climatic changes, in this case because of chalk deposits that make them extra fertile, but also the way in which we have transformed the earth to serve, well, not all of us, but some. And that some has been at the expense of many, many others. So I think trying to put this all together and to say that, again, the climatic past as well as the contemporary times and the disease environments in the 1680s onwards, 1700s, explains, I think, adds an extra dimension to how we might think about this otherwise.
How has this left you feeling about faith in technology, that technology will have the answer to all of this, that we'll be able to manipulate the weather to solve the problems of climate change?
I think that science and technology will solve many of the problems and might even solve them quite quickly. And there are lots of reasons to be positive. I mean, the introduction of LED lights that, I know a lot of people complain that the light isn't quite so beneficent, but has saved huge amounts of carbon emissions, cut down the use of energy very dramatically. And if that was rolled across into the developing world, some estimates say that would save 320 million cubic meters of carbon every year and save $40 billion of costs. So there are all sorts of ways in which improvements can be made. At the moment, globally, about not more than 900 million tons of food is thrown away, despite global poverty and despite poverty in the United Kingdom. And that's enough to fill 23 million 40-ton trucks, which bumper to bumper would stretch around the world 7 times. Some of those things don't seem to be beyond the wit of humans to be able to try to solve, to make us a bit more cost and a bit more resource aware. But the science is chasing a bus that's out of control, or a vehicle that's out of control. And so even if you can stop some of the things, and maybe many of the things, it would seem to me that those benefits won't be shared equally. So, for example, New York City uses as much energy as the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. And the challenges we'll face, we have a much higher level of protection in a rich country in the northern hemispheres than perhaps others. And our question, I think, in the future will be, how do we mitigate and stop and prevent people whose suffering is going to be acuter and faster than ours? And are we really doing enough? And I think that I have very little confidence around those kinds of things, having followed the COP summits over the years, having seen the talk about limited action, and even the Paris agreements that be featured so heavily on your news show. Not a single G20 country is within its own limits that it set in 2015. So I'm optimistic, but I'm also pragmatic and realistic.
What have you learned in the course of doing The Earth Transformed about why the world is the way it is now? So if you think about the developed world and the developing world, I suppose we're sort of familiar with the idea that, in hotter countries, disease is more rife. It tends, there's less political stability than there is in colder countries, and maybe that's something to do with why wealth is distributed the way it is. What about things like political systems? If you look at China, do you have any sense of why China is the way it is politically, and whether that's got anything to do with climate?
I think there one struggles because the determinism is a real thing to avoid. So you say, well, this is what China is ecologically, therefore they produce a system with a single person up at the top, which quite clearly I think isn't the case. What is the case is that if you trade a lot, what tends to happen is that mercantile interests try to protect themselves from privation from the ruler or from whatever. So in this country, for example, as Britain became wealthier and more people became rich, Parliament stepped in not to give rights to anybody, but to protect the interests of a growing upper class, as it was, and to stop the king from taking us into wars that were costly and you might lose. And that process of trying to negotiate to put limits on autocratic power was an important part of our process here. China obviously works in a very different way, even though it declares in its constitution that it's a democracy under the dictatorship of the Communist Party. So in terms of its political system, it is highly autocratic, centralized, and so on. In terms of how decisions are made behind closed doors and often out of sight and out of ears, the ability of local elites to be able to get what they want and to be able to extract looks to me quite profound. So the amount of money that leaches out of China suggests that this isn't a single structure that has no gaps in it, that allows full control. But I think that one has to be anxious about trying to be too predictive about what the past can tell us about why things are going to be as they might be in the future. So China, you could argue, has a structure that looks imperial and has always been imperial. But there are many other places that are climatically quite similar that haven't gone down that pathway. But if you factor in China's case, the Great Leap Forward, you put in deaths measuring in their tens of millions through famine in the 20th century, you can see that might concentrate minds towards avoiding resistance to the political centre.
Let's just talk about determinism for a moment. What is it, first of all?
Well, determinism is having an answer and then saying, therefore, anything I can link back to that is why things happened, and sort of predetermining what you want to look for. So, for example, if you wanted to show why people in Britain are rich, and you said, well, because it rains a lot here, and therefore people spend time indoors, and therefore they're in laboratories and they're testing things, and there's lots of science as a result, that might sound not too far off the truth on one hand. On the other hand, you say, if that was the case, how come there wasn't a great deal of science in England or Britain before 15, 16, 1700? Why did things happen in that way? So the key, I think, is to not pick a single solution that solves everything. And so one way around that is to put climate as one of a series of factors, and then it's up to each individual historian and each individual reader to see how they want to prioritize. But determinism is kind of locking in the answer and, like a mathematical equation, working backwards to show the working.
And do you think that climate hasn't been given the thought or the prominence that it should have done
I think in the ancient world, you find ancient Greek writers saying, the climate has changed dramatically. We need to understand why, and if we don't work out how to live more sustainably, we're all going to end up dying. So it's often being covered. I think the big difference in today's world is that the tools that we have to measure are exponentially different to anything that's gone before. So, in fact, Thomas Jefferson, the U.S. president, one of the founding fathers, was obsessed by taking climate measurements. And the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed, he went to Sparhawk's, a sort of a apothecary's shop in Philadelphia, to go and buy a thermometer. He took two temperature measurements every single day for decades. And we have his notebook, so we can see what the temperature was, 72.5 degrees Fahrenheit, on the day that Declaration of Independence was signed. The next day, he obviously wasn't happy because he went back to go and buy a barometer. And Jefferson was maybe obsessed is probably the fair word to say, that he was obsessed that the climate of the United States was changing. And other scholars at the same time said, you're just making a statement, we need to measure it. And so lots of people have been interested in trying to work out how things have changed, but our ability to be able to look at it scientifically and accurately means that we're thinking about things in a very different way. It's not anecdotal. It's not, it seems that it's hotter. It seems that it's raining a lot more or a lot less. It's that you can actually measure these things. And that's not just because of the way in which data information has been gathered. All the ships that sailed from England and from the Netherlands in the 1800s recorded the wind speeds 3 times a day. And we have these ships logs, so you can have these enormous data sets. But it's also the scientific tools to look back into the past, and often the deep, distant past, tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago, suddenly allows you to not just make statements about weather and climate, but to measure them. And that, I think, is something that is really quite new in our field.
Does it leave you thinking that we are looking at an extinction event, that we are living through one already, or do you find yourself sort of stepping back and going, well, we've lived through periods like this?
Well, I'd like to be happy and smiley and highly optimistic. I think that reading through some of the materials that are being done by scientists working on this in their day-to-day, and I'm reading their materials rather than participating, it's almost overwhelming, the scale of the challenges. And those are not just about climatic changes, also about resource exploitation and the ways in which our supply chains, for example, have spread pathogenic diseases and the wrong kinds of animals into the wrong kinds of parts of the world that can lead to massive biodiversity changes and loss. And I suppose the starting point is, when some animals and plants die, others win. But those losses are already at a point where some mammals are moving about 10 kilometers further north per decade. Fish are sinking deeper into the sea. And when one starts to because it's so warm at surface temperatures, and when one starts to layer in just how much of this is going on in terms of amphibian loss, bird loss, animal type losses across the whole spectrum, it's pretty sobering, I think, around the call to arms of what should we be actually doing to face up to the challenges this is going to throw up at us. And there are pockets of light, technologies, things that we have done. We're in the European Union and Britain, we're producing less emissions than we did 25 years ago, but we're still moving upwards globally. And I think that it doesn't make me feel hopeful and optimistic about the next generation. And I think, whereas a historian, that's most worrying to me, is that there was some work done before Christmas where in developed economies, the percentage of people under the age of 45 who don't believe, in liberal democracies, don't believe that we need to have regular elections, is now sitting above 50%. And some of that is because of climate and the anxieties. Some of that is about the chaos of the political spectrum that we've seen in the last few years. Some of that is about cost of living and student debts and the ability to buy houses. And they feel that the generation, which I'm ashamed to say I'm part of, has had a 30-year live like there's no tomorrow, spend the bank, keep borrowing, and it'll all be fine. And that tab is going to be picked up in due course. And how that plays out will be unpredictable, not necessarily chaotic and violent, but will produce shocks that we should probably be spending a bit of time thinking about.
So you cite at the beginning of the book, religious beliefs in sort of divine interventions where God has sent plagues and floods to kill off a section of the population. I mean, do you think that's what we're looking at? Does history tell us that, well, that just happens every so often? And so we're probably due one.
I'm not. I mean, there are people much better qualified to me to talk about the future. I think what is interesting about those examples, and for example, the flood of Noah that is in the Book of Genesis, it's in the Quran, it's in the Atrahasis, in the Book of the Heavenly Cow, these Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, is that our predecessors on this planet were acutely worried about environmental change and ecological catastrophe. And the Book of Genesis, again, the story of the creation. Adam and Eve are booted out of the Garden of Eden, where everything is plentiful and in wonderful supply, and by angering God by eating from the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve consign their descendants to a land that's ecologically stressed, of having to try and grow crops in the dust and having to face these environmental catastrophes. And the Rig Vedas that you mentioned already, it's a very similar story, that you are punished by gods if you don't give them offerings in the right way, if you don't observe the right rituals. And that's something which we find in Mesoamerican cultures, in Andean cultures, almost everywhere. When we find the written records and oral traditions that survive, it's around how people are really worried about living unsustainably, and that if you get things wrong, you face catastrophic consequences. And one of the stories in that is therefore to learn how to prepare for them. And resilience and working out how vulnerable you are is the key way to be doing that. And again, I think there are ways in which we should all be trying to think that through a lot harder in a more joined up kind of way.
As a historian, how have you found embracing the science? Have you studied science?
Great. It's great. I mean, when you study, you don't end when you finish your undergraduate degree or your PhD. You should keep on learning. And for me, one of the challenges has been to learn how to read through articles about genomic data, so we can see how people are moving and migrating in the past, not because somebody wrote about them, but because we can take measurements from bones. We can see from teeth what people are eating and where the food is grown, where it's coming from. And keeping up with that kind of materials with statistical analysis, it's a challenge. But, it's not that hard to learn a language. It's not that hard to learn about mathematics. But it just requires a bit of investment. And, I'm a professor. That's also some would say that's my job, is to be learning and studying and not be scared of it. And I happen to work in a university where I've got some of the world's experts in each of these fields. So you can either nobble over a pint or go to their lectures and ask them questions.
But does it make you think that in this country, at least, we specialise too soon and we choose between arts and sciences?
Well, I think we definitely believe that there is something called humanities and something called STEM. And in my field, it's inconceivable that future historians can have no scientific background.
So, I mean, as we get to sort of where this has left you, has it turned you at all into a climate activist?
Since Newsround, I've been very aware of acid rain and of factories belching fumes. I think that environmental consciousness also goes alongside social consciousness about where are things being made and what kind of standards are you looking for every time you buy a jacket and a coat. It's not just about what's being belched into the atmosphere. It's what are the conditions and the way in which people are paid for, whether it's fair trade coffee through to anything. So I think that there's a responsibility to do it and to be extremely conscious of one's footprint. I'm very aware of my ecological footprint, but also of my social as well, that there are different parts of the world where you have to be quite careful about how you engage. But I think all of us need to try to do more to live in sustainable ways. But it's a personal decision, and it's definitely one which everyone has to reach their own conclusions around.
Do you think we consider enough the impact on the environment of historical events that haven't occurred to us?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I was thinking about when I got to the second half of the 20th century is to, first of all, to work out when it was that the world started to warm. And in fact, we can measure sea level rises starting in about 1863. So that's quite a long run towards where we've got to today. But one of the things that I was really interested in was looking at what the impacts were of atmospheric nuclear bomb testing in the 1940s and 1950s, up until 1963. So about 400 tests are done of very substantial nuclear, atomic and hydrogen bombs that obviously had an impact atmospherically. In fact, some people thought that the detonating of the first weapon of mass destruction might ignite the atmosphere and kill us all. In fact, Hitler was briefed about this, and even Hitler was not particularly amused by the idea of being in charge of the Third Reich as the Earth turned into a glowing star. But these tests, the science and the astrophysicists and the physicists looked at it and said, well, this is going to be fine. But those tests over the course of about 15 years dramatically slowed down, were a factor in slowing down warming temperatures because of the ejection of soot into the atmosphere. And the seminal paper that's written about nuclear testing was done in 1983 in the Newsround years, where a group of scholars in the States modelled what a nuclear war would do, and the impacts between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the impact was so acute of pushing us into about minus 20 degrees for about a year, wherever you were in the world, was an alarm bell that went through. First of all, an alarm bell went through the Soviet Union, who thought here was a chance to be able to have some kind of pushback on weapons testings that would serve the Soviet Union. But the alarm spilt through into the public domain incredibly quickly. People had always been resistant to nuclear devices, the CND movements and others in the 60s and 70s, hugely significant in trying to move us away from the ability to inflict pain on each other. But that moment in the mid-80s suddenly became an important moment around a realization that it wasn't just about global rivalries, it was about all of us potentially being at risk. And I think that was a kind of key point where we really did understand how vulnerable our species is to our own decisions, in this case being made by two men. I mean, the President of the United States doesn't need congressional approval to launch the nuclear arsenal of the United States, doesn't need clearance from the US Army. He's the commander-in-chief. And there have been moments in the last few years where some people have been worried about that.
Well, I mean, you say right at the beginning, and we're the same age, and so our childhoods were, certainly for me, genuinely being afraid that the world was going to be destroyed, that nuclear war was going to end everything. Why is it, do you think, that fear of global destruction is quite limited to quite a small part of history? If nuclear technology began in the 40s, it took until perhaps the 80s before we were actually afraid of the world being destroyed, and that period seems to be over.
Well, I think we've had a few rude awakenings in the last couple of years. That Cold War, the end of the Cold War that many had thought was sort of baked in and done, maybe either didn't end in the way we thought it did, or maybe didn't even end at all. And clearly, the fact that Putin has put his nuclear forces on alert during the Ukraine war is one example of that. The Chinese government at the weekend just announced that they're going to raise defense spending by 7% in the next year, including testings of an investment into both nuclear and space armaments. I think we just went on to pause for 30 years. I think we thought that the Berlin Wall coming down, the post-Tiananmen Square, China, that this was a world where we would all end up getting richer, and suddenly we're sitting in a world where, so funnily enough, these last 30 years suddenly look much more difficult, even in retrospect. You know, 9/11 events and the Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria events that happened as well in Libya. Likewise, the war in Ukraine, the invasions which started in 2014, and then in Georgia in 2008, the global financial crisis, the pandemic. You know, one could make the case that these last 30 years have been hugely traumatic and very, very dangerous. It's just we didn't really realize what we were doing. So it's not that those threats went away. It's that over the last 30 years, we fell asleep at the wheel, or we were too busy to bother checking the rearview mirror. And suddenly we've got these big challenges behind us. And climate is one of those. China is another one in all of its different manifestations. Putin, for sure, another. Future diseases, likewise. Migrations. All these kinds of really existential questions. And none of them have suddenly popped up. They've all been there. It's just, I think we have been too busy thinking that the music would never, ever stop. But history is all about the music coming to an end at some point. And if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, it's game over. If you can survive it, if you can plan for it, if you can be resilient, then things are very different. But history is all about those empty, ruined cities, those places you go to visit for Instagram snaps rather than a vibrant centres of commerce and of populations today.
If you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
Well, I'd like people to read my book. I think that change has never happened with one person, but it's about ground roots, and that is now bubbling. I think certainly here in Europe, people are hugely aware and sensitive around the fact that we are facing problems, and if we start to make demands of our governments, elections and elsewhere, that we expect to see action on global warming, on natural resource exploitation, and on fairer ways of exploiting the environment, which don't have to mean changing capitalism, doesn't have to change the way in which we live, but moderating and mitigating, investing, then I think we can find change. But that comes from lots of people asking for our leaders to share their vision with us rather than kicking the can down the road.
Peter Frankopan, thank you very much indeed.